What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Ultimate X-Men. By the way, remember tomorrow we're covering Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, but the name changes to Future Foundation. Just be aware of that. So getting into Ultimate X-Men, or really kind of finishing this first volume that we started a couple weeks ago, this basically brings in Wolverine. Now, Ultimate Universe Wolverine is starkly different than the main Marvel Universe Wolverine in a lot of different ways. There's similarities, but there's also a lot of differences here. So one of the things that happens, and one of the things you remember from the last video that we did, is that Magneto contacted Wolverine for the purpose of basically getting in and finding a way to kill Charles Xavier. And so once Wolverine basically emerges from the airport, which the question is asked, how in the world did you manage to get through an airport without setting off like metal detectors or anything like that? It's the usual response that Marvel Comics gives us, just kind of a hand-wavy explanation. Well, you gotta know a guy, that kind of a thing, right? Marvel just usually dodges that all the time. But once he's out here, we end up finding out that he's immediately attacked by what's basically the federal government and then subdued, right? Like literally Wolverine seems to die right off the bat, or at least is captured right off the bat. Now, that's when we switch over to the Ultimate X-Men. And of course, Xavier calls the team together and says, okay, we have another mutant signature that exists out there. I need all of you to meet me in the danger room because this one is a really significant moment. And that's when he reveals to the team, Wolverine is basically in our general vicinity. Like Wolverine has resurfaced and he's effectively been captured. Now, the response of the X-Men here kind of comes in two parts. The ones who have been around the block a few times are scared out of their wits. The ones who are new here don't know anything and they're more curious than anything else. What Marvel establishes here, and this is where things get a little interesting and you really kind of deviate away from the normal main Marvel universe when it comes to how Wolverine's handled, that Wolverine here in the Ultimate Universe is literally the world's deadliest man. Like, he's the deadliest assassin that exists in the world. Now, there is a lot of history there, but the history of Wolverine here is wildly different than the history of Wolverine in the main Marvel Universe. And honestly, when Wolverine's introduced to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this is the way in which it'll be done. The origin story in the Ultimate Universe, that's how it'll happen. Now, if you are curious about that, once we're done with this video, I believe I have a video on the ultimate origin of Wolverine that's already been done. So you're welcome to check that out once this video is finished. I'll have the link to it down in the description and we'll post a link to it at the end of the video. But still, it's a pretty cool story, right? But the thing about this is that Wolverine was actually captured by what was basically Weapon X, right? Weapons Plus, if you want to call it that. Now, again, this is where things differ. In the main Marvel Universe, Wolverine and Weapon X, they do have a bit of a sketchy history insofar as like Wolverine's not the closest and the best of friends with like Maverick or Sabretooth or Silver Fox or any of those guys. But the fact that they serve so long as a team allows them to kind of call in favors with the other if they ever really need it. Here in the Ultimate Universe, there's a dark history here. And while we don't necessarily get the nitty gritty of it here in this particular story, one of the things that we do learn is that Wolverine was really more of kind of an expendable asset for Weapon X in the sense that they would just send him into missions where men would normally be killed. They'd have Wolverine do his duty and then they would bring him back. But they would also torment and torture him, right? Like, one of the things that's said by Wraith is how much fun they used to have with his healing factor, right? Like setting him on fire or different things like that just to see how things happen. Like, it was very much a terrible situation for the character of Wolverine. And that's one of the reasons why he became the person that he was. Now, again, Wolverine's origin in the Ultimate Universe is actually closely intertwined with the origin of Captain America, Steve Rogers, and really more Nick Fury than anything else, right? Like Samuel Jackson, Nick Fury. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool origin story, and I think it's probably one of the better origin stories for his character. But of course, the X-Men basically respond as you expect them to. They show up here on the scene, and they are basically able to free Wolverine from Weapon X, and they ultimately bring Wolverine in, onto the team, and then bring him back to the Xavier Institute. Now, this is the beauty of the situation, right? Because at that point, we transition to Magneto, and what Magneto reveals is, this is all part of the plan. Right, this was literally all part of the plan. The goal of Wolverine, right, the whole idea, what happened here, Wolverine basically resurfaces. He's like, the government's tipped off to the location of Wolverine. Wolverine's captured. Wolverine's basically held for a little while. The X-Men will ultimately end up saving him, right, because, the X-Men save mutants and they're good guys and so on and so forth, right? So they're highly predictable. And in doing so, because they don't really know the actual mission of Wolverine, and because they are a humanitarian group insofar as how they deal with like mutant relations, they would bring Wolverine into the team. So it's literally just a giant Trojan horse, and it's a genius idea. Now, the other part of this, and what makes things so wild, is that once Wolverine is here, initially Jean Grey rebukes him, but it's one of those things where she does it because in reality, she doesn't want to come off too easy, right? That's kind of how that is. In the Ultimate Universe, and it's one of those weird things, Wolverine and Jean Grey end up having a relationship, right? And we'll talk about that here in a minute because it does happen in this story, you know, they basically end up banging. But of course, there's the kind of grudge that takes place between Wolverine and Cyclops. And so what you end up getting is really Jean Grey who kind of looks at Wolverine with a bit of interest because he's the bad boy, right? Like Cyclops is the good guy. He's predictable, right? He is as predictable as the sun rises. And in time, that will be the thing that like Jean Grey will become interested in, right? Because the lack of certainty and the lack of stability and this whole thing of like, I don't know what tomorrow brings, that only lasts for a little while. Then it gets old, right? Because then you want something reliable. You want someone reliable. And so ultimately what would end up happening here is that with Jean Grey and Wolverine, she's very, very smitten. She's very, very interested in him. And basically the two of them end up banging, right? Like literally they just end up banging. Like he just runs up on her, just gives her a kiss, that kind of a thing. Because he's one of those guys where he's like, it's, you know, like, I'm not the guy you say no to, right? And that kind of thing is what really, really attracts her, right? The good girl who loves the bad boy. That's really all it is. But the crazy thing about all this is that while that whole romantic kind of fling and everything's going on, while there's a lot of flirting going on between the two of them before anything serious happens, that Magneto makes his move and literally kidnaps the president's daughter, right? Like just kidnaps this girl and holds her ransom, right? And literally just like makes this declaration to like the world at large that like, I have the president's daughter, right? Like you will cease and desist any actions against the mutant population, hunting us down, different things like that, or I will take your daughter out, right? Like, I mean, not on a date either. Like I'm gonna like, you know, I'm gonna help her finish with all of her living, right? If you understand what I'm saying, like that's basically what that means. And so it's one of those things where it really is a dangerous gambit because it could go either way. On one hand, the president could double down and say, okay, we're gonna come after you harder than they were before. But the reality here is the president's a family man, right? Like it's his daughter. And so in a lot of ways, as you would expect with a traditional fictional story like this, the president ultimately backs down. But in doing so, it emboldens Magneto. And so what ends up happening here is you basically have a mission organized by the X-Men, which are sent to what's basically Croatia, where the daughter of the president's being held, in order to find her, to free her, and to bring her to effectively safety, right? Like to literally save her life. For the most part, it happens, right? Not all the X-Men really go on, or at least, you know, save the president's daughter. Some basically stay here and end up dealing with like Magneto and so on and so forth. And it kind of goes, you know, in terms of it being a bit of a fight. It is cool, right? Because you do remember have characters like Storm and so on, who are the new people here, right? I mean, remember in the last video that we covered, Storm is new to her powers. She doesn't know exactly how her abilities work. So she's figuring it out as it goes along. It's not like the main Marvel universe where she was brought in by Professor Xavier with just total control over her abilities, even on the most nuanced levels. She's literally just discovered them. Not only that, of course, you do also have Cyclops behind enemy lines. You've got all these guys here who are doing what they can to hold their own against the forces of Magneto. And the funny thing is that once the daughter is off and safe, right? Like literally Wolverine saves her life, takes off, that's basically it. The rest of the X-Men actually start talking to Magneto to kind of find out what it is that he's even going for here, right? Like, what were you hoping to really achieve by kidnapping the president's daughter? Because unless you were going to hold on to her forever, right? Unless like you were just going to keep her in a bunker for the rest of her life, you know, there's only so much that's actually going to come out of this. And even then, like once that president leaves office, a new president's going to come in and he doesn't much care about the other president's daughter, right? So literally this plan you have is only going to last however long the president's term lasts. And then it's going to be on like Donkey Kong, right? Like that's literally what it's going to be. So this is kind of a stupid maneuver. But the reality here for Magneto is it was more of a show of force. It was more of showing humanity that even their most highest ranking officials, right? The president of the United States, a man who is believed to be untouchable, is not untouchable. That mutants can get to humanity just as easily as humanity can get to mutants. They simply just choose not to. And so as a result of that, it's really more him just kind of being like, either you can play ball with us, right? Like you as the X-Men, you can play ball on our side, or you will be our enemy, you will get caught in the crossfire, and I will inevitably destroy you, right? So it's really more just kind of a warning, hence the reason why he lets them leave. But once you switch back to basically Beast, of course, who had been injured in the process, this is one of the interesting things about his character. Because he had been injured and there wasn't really kind of an easy way to cure him, there is talk about a cure that exists out there in the world, but there have basically been, you know, instances whereby those individuals individuals who have been cured using this particular process end up developing blue fur, right? Or like blue hair or something like that. So it's just kind of the Ultimate Universe way of being like, this is how Hank McCoy becomes the big furry blue guy that you all love, right? You know, that kind of a thing. But it's still cool because, again, you basically switch over to Jean Grey and Wolverine, and literally, like, Wolverine just straight up asks her, he's like, how do you feel about me, Jean? And she's like, honestly, I'm not sure I particularly like you, Wolverine, right? Like, sure, you've proved yourself as an X-Man, but I haven't bought this idea that you're an overnight convert to Professor Xavier's, like, you know, integration ideology, right? Like, you're not one of us, right? Like, you're not a good guy. You're really not for the cause. And she's like, your Weapon X training might mean that I can't read the thoughts that you don't want me to, but I'm empathetic enough to know that you're here for all the wrong reasons. I think the way people have treated you over the years has really screwed you up. And as much as it goes against everything the school's supposed to stand for, I really, really wish I'd never met you. And so that's when he asked the question, then why do you find me so attractive? And her response is, I wish I knew. And literally, guy just lays the kiss on her, and Cyclops is just watching it all happen, right? Like, ever the cuck. Cyclops is just watching the girl he likes basically get banged by somebody else. See, this is one of the things about this, right? Because, like, in response to that, instead of Cyclops, like, nutting up and just be like, okay, so here's the deal, Jean, that guy's a dick, right? And, like, you don't need that guy. He's a terrible dude. I'm better than he is, right? Like, I'm the guy you should be going after, right? Like, let's make something happen here, like fighting for what he wants, right? Like, in the end, he's just like, I'm gonna leave the team, you know, and it's just like, okay, like, come on, man, like, that's your response, right? This guy comes out of nowhere, snatches up the girl that you like, and your response is to quit? Like, no wonder you're gonna lose that girl, man. Like, there are some things in this world that if you want it, you're gonna have to learn to fight for it. Now, not every girl's worth fighting for, but like, that one is. So you should go fight for that one, you know, and it's one of those crazy things, right? And so ultimately, basically Cyclops ends up meeting with Xavier, and it's just like, I don't believe in this dream that you have anymore, right? Like, Magneto's response kind of resonated with me, and I believe what it was that Magneto had to say. So I'm basically leaving, like, literally he takes off. Now, in reality here, that's all a show. I mean, the truth of the reason why Cyclops is leaving is because the girl he likes is banging another dude, and he just can't handle it, right? And so he also ultimately ends up taking off and basically joining Magneto's side. Now, that's where things get really cool, because at this point, what we end up doing is basically picking up with like the first real mission that is launched with Cyclops and really Magneto's brotherhood and so on, and even with the X-Men basically being called together by Professor X. Now, one of the things that goes on is like Wolverine's like, okay, so like what's the deal? You know, like what's going on? And Jean's like, well, the professor needs us, and he's like, okay, well, like we'll get to it in like 20 minutes, right? And the two of them go back to banging again, right? It is weird because technically Jean, I think, is like 19 and Wolverine's like 40, right? It's kind of a strange situation. But the reality here is that Professor Xavier called the X-Men together because the president requested the presence of Magneto. And what the president had learned is that Magneto is based in the Savage Land, right? Like literally a jungle in Antarctica that has like dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff. I know the Ultimate Universe is supposed to be rooted in the real world. Go with it. It's a comic book. It's not supposed to be 100% real. Just have fun with it, right? Who cares? But the thing about this is that the response of the president is like, look, this guy kidnapped my daughter and I can't let that go. So we're launching a full-on strike against Magneto. Like, we're basically deploying all the Sentinels we have at our disposal and we're sending them there. And we're going to basically annihilate the entirety of Magneto's forces because we have to show not only the American people, but we have to show the world. The United States will not stand for this level of intolerance. Now, the truth about this and what's so interesting is it really is the human race creating its own problem and then trying to eliminate the problem that it created, right? Like, mutants just existed. I mean, it's not like mutants were just running around just trying to eradicate the whole of humanity. They simply just existed. The response of the human race was to annihilate mutants out of fear or to capture them and kill them or whatever the case happens to be, which is what led to a guy like Magneto in the first place. And so it's kind of nuts because what you end up getting is literally the entirety of the Sentinel really army just showing up at the Savage Land, and then Magneto literally scoffs, and you would expect him to, right? He's like, really? Like, humanity is going to send an army of metal robots against the master of magnetism, right? If this is not a full-on depiction of humanity's stupidity, I really don't know what is. How dumb would you have to be to send an army of metal robots against a guy who can control metal. Like, humanity's got to be the stupidest organism on the entirety of the earth. It's a good thing I'm gonna wipe them all out, right? Like, it's like, I'm doing you a favor by putting you out of your misery because you're all too stupid to keep living. That's literally Magneto's response here, right? Like, you guys are dumb, you know, it's a laughable situation. And so not only do these Sentinels come arriving here, once they do, Magneto doesn't immediately destroy them. Instead, he uses his powers over magnetism and just his incredible amount of knowledge on computers and all that kind of stuff to literally rewire the entirety of the Sentinels, to basically reprogram them and then turn them to his side. So the army of humanity just became the army of Magneto. And that's the thing, like, humanity developed an army that was capable of destroying mutants. Imagine what this army could do if it was turned on humans who don't have powers, who don't have abilities, right? And so what ends up happening here is we end up finding out that where Wolverine had joined the X-Men as basically a plant by Magneto, that Cyclops is on Magneto's team as a plant for Xavier. Like, literally, when all this is popping off, Cyclops is like, Professor X, this is Cyclops, we have a situation here, sir. Like, it was basically a move. Right now, at that same time, we jump back to Jean Grey and Wolverine. Literally, Wolverine reveals to Jean Grey that he was here to kill Professor X. Right now, Jean Grey, of course, freaks out because she's just like she just starts screaming at him and cussing at him. But the whole reason why Wolverine did this, and the argument he creates, is like, meeting you and being with you has basically changed my mind. This story's written by Mark Miller, so it's one of those Mark Miller-esque things where he's just like, we need a reason for Wolverine to basically turn coat. I don't know, Jean Grey was really good in bed, so like, that's reason enough, and like, that's really all you get, right? But it's basically him just joining the side of the X-Men. Now, of course, with Wolverine on the side of the X-Men, Cyclops within the Mutant Brotherhood, and on the side of Magneto, or at least on the side of Xavier within Magneto's ranks, that is one of those things where he actually takes Quicksilver aside. Now, the cool thing about this, and this is one of the most significant moments, Quicksilver is the son that had always been overlooked by Magneto, and in a lot of ways had always just kind of been talked down to, right? Magneto never really took him seriously. He's just kind of like, you're incompetent, you always get things wrong, yada, 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 but basically setting the stage for Quicksilver to effectively turn against his father and to walk away. And so once this like conflict begins, right? Like, these Sentinels, like the X-Men show up, the Sentinels start attacking the X-Men start attacking the Sentinels, this massive battle unfolds between like both teams, that it is cool to see some of this stuff happen, right? You have Storm, who's getting a better understanding of her abilities, so being able to destroy Sentinels using lightning and so on is working pretty well. But Magneto has basically launched his attack against the President of the United States, right? Going after the White House. Magneto shows up here and literally has the president just cowering in fear, naked on the ground, right? And that's literally when he's just like, listen carefully, Homo sapiens. This is like one of the best speeches ever, right? He says, because I will say this only once, your reign as Earth's dominant species is formally at an end. The creature you regard as the most powerful man has just cleaned my boots, right? His execution now will serve as a warning to other world leaders who refuse to recognize the new position in the coming global order, right? He says, obey us and you may live as our slaves and playthings. Disobey and you will be categorized as mutant foodstuffs. America dies tonight at the age of 225. Your intolerance and all-consuming greed will not be missed. And that's the crazy thing, is this because, you know, the United States, in the eyes of a lot of other nations around the world within the Ultimate Universe, is looked at as like, kind of like the major player. So it's the smartest move of Magneto to launch a strike against the United States. So literally, what's it gonna be, right? Like, because I'm taking over this place. What's gonna happen now? Now, at that moment, it basically leads to Professor Xavier making his move. There is a bit of a fight between like Magneto and Professor X. It is kind of, I mean, it's not funny, but it's a little bit funny because like Magneto just like knocks him out of his wheelchair and he's just like, I've had enough of you, old man. Like, it's one of those things. I mean, it's not something that would be funny if you saw it in real life, but it's funny as hell here. You know, it's one of those things that's kind of messed up, but still, like, it's one of those instances where, for the most part, they're really kind of powerless in the face of Magneto, because this is a guy who can control virtually every form of metal that exists in the world, and he can manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, one of the big differences here is that Magneto in the Ultimate Universe is not as powerful as he is in the main Marvel Universe. However, there are things that he does in the Ultimate Universe that are different than what he's done in the main Marvel Universe. For example, another video that we'll have linked in the description is a video called Ultimatum, where basically Magneto takes Thor's hammer and then attacks the world. It's cool, right? It's amazing. It's just one of those coolest things. But nonetheless, like, you end up having basically Professor X, who's just like, okay, here's the thing, Magneto, right? Like, while you're so caught up in your hubris and you're so caught up in whether or not you're right and you're showing the world that you're going to capture it all, you're not paying attention to the bigger picture. You're not looking at what's really going on around you. And when the response to Magneto is like, what the hell you're talking about, Wolverine makes his move and stabs him in the back, right? Now, the thing about this is that where he's able to claw and slash at Magneto, remember, like, Wolverine is a guy with adamantium on his bones. So literally Magneto just seizes control of him, like just holds him in place, and then sends a spike flying right through him and then incapacitates Wolverine. In response to that, because of the fact that his Sentinel forces have basically been almost totally obliterated by the X-Men, there isn't much left for him to do. He makes a last-ditch effort and he activates nuclear bombs across the country and literally like sends these missiles into the air with the intention of detonating them everywhere he can. And so what ends up happening here is Quicksilver, having had enough of his father and basically feeling betrayed by Magneto, as well as finally coming to terms with the fact that Magneto just literally wiping out the entirety of the United States is obviously not a good idea. He ends up using his super speed, whisks off the helmet of Magneto, which gives Professor Xavier the ability to basically take over Magneto's mind. Because remember, Magneto's helmet, both in the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe, prevents Professor X from being able to read his thoughts or control his mind. So now it's wide open. And this allows Professor X to literally take over his head, to basically shut down his efforts to effectively launch these nuclear missiles across the world. And then in turn, he ends up killing Magneto. Like, encases him in a giant ball of metal, sends him flying into the air, and then the whole thing just gets destroyed, right? Like, that's literally all it is. And so Magneto is effectively killed. Here's the funny thing, he's not. Magneto's not dead, and there's actually a little more going on here than initially meets the eye. The only clue we get as far as what's going on with the bigger picture is you do have this sit down that takes place between Professor Xavier and Cyclops, where literally Professor X is like, okay, this was all just phase 1. Phase 2 is going to be a lot more interesting. And it is, right? The X-Men comics, I mean, they do go off the rails after a little while, right? They do kind of go nuts after a little while, but up until they do, things are amazing, right? It's one of the coolest stories to come out of the Ultimate Universe. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.